And we are back with Dr. Jonathan Collins with us tonight. He's a political science professor at Brown University. Dr. Collins, welcome back to BNC.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
So, Dr. Collins, obviously that story kind of troubling for any black person that hears it. I want to turn your attention to the statement specifically from a woman in that story we just showed you moments ago. She said, quote, all this curriculum highlights is the mean white people and how the person is victimized and speaks of nothing of the good. Some would argue that's exactly why the stories need to be told in the first place. What do you think about that?
I thought it was a very one-sided perspective on why it's important to teach the true history of this country. You know, why it was important to inject this in the first place is because, you know, for decades, since the construction of public education in the U.S., the history curriculum in particular has been, for lack of a better term, whitewashed. And so, you know, whether there is either no representation or an extreme lack of representation for black children seen in the way in which we teach our history classes across states, especially in the southern states, this has been a problem for an extremely long time. And so for Robin Steedman to have concern with the way in which white children might sort of have to deal with maybe some potential discomfort that comes along with learning that new truth, it's kind of dismissive of the fact that black children have had to deal with discomfort for generations and generations now, whether we're talking about history or the way in which our schools have just sort of divested from the importance of educating black children to the way in which we promise. So again, it's just a very one-sided perspective, and it doesn't acknowledge how important it is for black children to see black faces, especially positively represented black faces in our school, in our books, and in our curriculum.
And you brought up an interesting point, because one of the statements made in the story was that it makes these kids feel bad when they see these types of pictures or see this type of language in a book like that. But you got to recognize the fact that black people felt bad for how many years? So, you know, talking more about that particular story, there are 4 books that are in question that focus on MLK's March at Washington. Ruby Bridges, who was the first black person to desegregate an all-white elementary school in Louisiana, people who helped basically, you know, shape our future. Is it trying to get rid of this a major blow to the black community?
Well, I think it's a major blow to the black community, but I think it's a major blow to America. You know, the March on Washington was not just the march by black people. The March on Washington, the beauty of it was that it was this multiracial coalition of people who rose and took a stand against racism. It was people of all colors who are on the monument on that specific weekend. And so, you know, it rings true of kind of what we saw in the summer of 2020, when people of all different racial and ethnic backgrounds were marching for racial justice. It wasn't just black people marching for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Honestly, there were more white people probably than black people marching. And that's, you know, why we've seen more momentum on racial justice, I think, over the past year than we had maybe the 10 years before. And so again, is removing these books from the schools, is this something hazardous to black children? Yes, but it's hazardous to all children. Teaching this kind of history is important for everyone.
Yeah. And what type of impact does this have on our black and brown kids if certain parts of history are left out?
Well, again, it becomes the message of sort of what you can and cannot be. And so, you know, this is why media is so important. And so this is why the Black News Channel is so important. It's because here's a space where little kids can look up and see themselves in journalists, see themselves in people who are, you know, meteorologists. And without that representation, black children may not believe that those career paths are possible, that those lives are possible. And the same thing rings true with the representation in terms of like history. Can black children see themselves as the folks who are making history, the folks who are the saviors of this country, who are taking it in the right direction, who are on the right side from a moral perspective? When do most black children typically see black representation? It's usually centered around crime. It's usually centered around prison and incarceration, drug usage. And what we're trying to do with this curriculum is show that black people have been pioneers for justice, for equality, and for the moral integrity of this country for centuries.
Yeah, you made so many good points there, Dr. Collins. And how relevant is our past to this very same moment that we're living in today, especially when it comes to reshaping the future?
It's scarily it's scary how consistent this is with some of the things that we've seen in the past. And so you can go back as far as the Civil War, where the Civil War in itself was this breaking point where you had your politicians from the North versus the South, and the politicians of the North finally had to accept that America can't persist as long as slavery is legal. And so the country literally fractures over this issue of whether or not slavery should persist in America. And then as a result, what we saw in the South was everything became about race, and everything became about preserving the sanctitude of slavery, even things that had nothing to do with slavery. And so what we're seeing now is kind of a continuation of that, because it's not just that folks like Robin Stingman are trying to ban books from the classrooms in Williamson, Tennessee. It's that they're also leading fronts that are dangerous in different ways. They're also the champions for anti-masking, anti-vaxxing, things that are making it difficult for Black people to literally survive. These two don't seem connected, but these are the same voices driven by the same impetus. They want a world where white people have certain opportunities, and there seems to be a complete disregard as to whether Black people have not only a quality of education, but a life in general.
Yeah, and I know many people question, how can inclusion be taught if everything isn't included?
Yeah, that's the big question, is that we preach diversity, we preach equity, we preach inclusion, we preach the idea of America being a melting pot. But then when we try to introduce curriculum into our schools that really centers around this idea of showing America as a true melting pot, where its builders and its pioneers are different across backgrounds, then there's pushback. These two things can't be consistent. If we're going to be a melting pot, if we're going to be a country that lives together, we have to also love each other and embrace the true history of what made this country what it is.
Well, Dr. Collins, we appreciate you. Meteorologist Brittany Lockley, you brought us up, and me being a role model, and everyone here, for those students, they got to know the things that we've done to become pioneers for this country. We appreciate your time tonight.